Noi riprendiamo le sessioni del convegno. Le meccanismi per l'utilizzo e l'organizzazione di questa sessione. Noi facciamo due interventi, dopo una pausa di mezz'ora, dopo le altre due interventi e dopo la discussione. Thomas Safley dell'Università di Filadelfia, che non parlerà delle monete e le altre alternative dall'industria dalla prima età moderna. Quando volete. 20 minuti. Meglio.
Good morning. Alternatives to money take various forms and have a long history in extractive industry. In the mines of Central and Eastern Alpine Europe from the mid-15th to the late 17th century, especially the Mercury mines at Idria in the former Habsburg Duchy of Carniola, present-day Slovenia, they were ubiquitous, present even in its political economy. Granted mining privileges in the form of shares, supporters, merchant entrepreneurs, and aristocratic landlords who became stakeholders and operators. In return for the opportunity to profit from the mineral trade, operators rendered taxes on their production in both cash and kind, the so-called Fron.
Era stato messo i jack in questo
No, aspetta un attimo, io che devo fare, guardi qui. Io non so, metterò
But they needed the protection of the state in the form of concessions and regulations that lowered transaction costs, prevented competition, and limited risk. In return for monopoly rights and tax exemptions that increased profits from the sale of mercury, they advanced credit, shared intelligence, and performed services for the state. Local agents or factors saw to the running of the mines. Like factors in all branches of pre-modern commerce and finance, their salaries took the form not only of money, but also of opportunities to seize whatever gainful enterprise came their way. Mining also required highly skilled, experienced labor. Recruited from established mining regions and proudly self-conscious, the miners extracted and refined the saleable commodities, but exercised little control over production or remuneration. At Idria, therefore, alternatives to money existed at all levels: financial instruments and commercial commodities, economic opportunity and social status, legal privilege and political preferment, cash and kind. Taking extraction, production, and the sale of mercury as a test case with particular attention to the miners and their wages, this paper seeks to demonstrate that alternatives in whatever form, tangible or intangible, fixed or movable, have less to do with shortages of hard cash or the inhumanity of hard hearts, though these can and often do play a role, than what I have elsewhere referred to as the ecology of work. The phrase attempts to suggest how the interaction of physical environments, regulatory systems, market forces, social relations, and economic institutions, to name but a few possibilities, shape production processes and wage regimes in workshops and factories. In the context of mercury mining at Idria, the ecology of work determined the broad reliance on alternatives to money, their use and abuse, their persistence and intractability. As early as the 1530s, alternatives to money had become a source of contention and conflict at the mercury mines of Idria. In 1536, the Council of State for the Archduchy of Inner Austria, which included the territory around Idria, assigned a commission to examine the operation of the mines there. Its report noted irregularities in wages. Quote, "The workers complain about the Pfennwert. The agent doesn't pay the workers in cash, but instead gives them Pfennwert from horseback, so that what they might more easily acquire for cash, they must accept from the administrator or others at higher cost. Moreover, the administrator offers more or less to the workers without the knowledge of the court, according to his liking, so that the workers cannot purchase goods freely in the marketplace of Bischoflack or other communities, all of which contributes to the decline and disadvantage of the entire mine," close quote. The Deutsches Rechtswörterbuch defines Pfennwert or Pfennigwert as a, pardon me, as a, quote, prescribed quantity of any commodity that is usually sold in small amounts, foodstuffs sold at fixed prices and, accordingly, permitted to use in place of a monetary payment as replacement for or part of a wage, close quote. It applied to all the goods required to maintain and operate the mines, including tools, materials, and in this case, especially foodstuffs, clothing, and other provisions. In specific relationship to wages and as an alternative to cash, Pfennwert appears frequently in mine ordinances from the beginning of the mining boom in late medieval Europe, that is, from the 15th century. A 1580 mining ordinance promulgated specifically for the Mercury mine at Idria admonished mine operators and agents to use Pfennwert honestly. Quote, each worker should receive notice of the wages he has earned within 14 days and payment in a month's time in cash, and not encouraged or focused to accept Pfennwert against his will, close quote. In every instance, such directives sought to protect miners from disadvantage and damage, as Angelika Westermann put it, quote, because fair wages and punctual payments secured the existence of the workers, kept them in the mines, and preserved social peace, close quote. The dissemination of similar ordinances suggests that the practice became commonplace in extractive industry across the Holy Roman Empire. Under private entrepreneurship, manipulation of the Pfennwert trade provided mine operators and merchant entrepreneurs with an additional and irresistible source of income. Scholars have reckoned it as high as 10,000 to 15,000 Rheinische Gulden per annum at the silver mines around Schwaz in Tyrol. At Idria, the local agent arbitrarily withheld wages from the miners, replacing them with food and clothing, which he valued at far higher rates than those he paid or those charged at local marketplaces. It's not yet possible to calculate the profits from the Pfennwert trade at Idria, but the miners there complained regularly, beginning in the 1530s, as we have seen. In 1575, the Inner Austrian State Council bought out the stakeholders and assumed direct operation of the mines in an effort to generate a more consistent stream of revenue from the sale of mercury. Like his predecessors in the private sector, the state-appointed agent controlled the Pfennwert trade and abused it ceaselessly. The miners responded with more direct action. Work stoppages occurred in 1579, 1580, 1601 to 1602, 1607, 1615 to 18, 1630 to 31, and 1636. The intensified pace reflects the crisis conditions of that time. Yet the complaints remained the same, centering on corruption, both in the valuation of Pfennwert and in the award of subcontracting work known as Lehnschaft, of which more later. Remedies usually took the form of short-term responses, not fundamental changes in work or wage regimes. The continued resistance of workers who received substandard goods at above-market prices when they received anything at all led to regular but futile attempts to regulate the trade. The question is why? If fair wages and regular payment assured a stable workforce, regular production, and social peace, to paraphrase Westermann, then agents and operators, state and capital, had a common interest in avoiding the use of Pfennwert, or at the very least, not misusing it. Regulations suggest that the state recognized this logic, but as complaints and strikes indicate, could not follow it. Capital, it seems, did not see like a state. In the eyes of merchants, operators, and their representatives, control of the Pfennwert trade was a perquisite of the privilege granted by the regent, an alternative to money. Miners accepted it as an essential alternative to money wages, though they clearly preferred cash for the freedom it offered, rejecting only the abuses that kept them at the level of subsistence. The ecology of work in the mines at Idria helps explain the multiplicity and intricacy of alternatives to money. When mining began at Idria in the 15th century, the place was nothing more than a remote, rugged corner of Europe. The topography had several effects. First, it limited agriculture to herding and forestry. Local peasants could produce very little grain, so that it and other foodstuffs had to be imported from outside the region. Second, it constrained population density. This meant that settlements and, more importantly, marketplaces did not exist in the immediate vicinity of Idria. The community of Bischoflacht, mentioned by miners in 1536, lies no less than 42 kilometers away. Third and last, the topography constrained local access. 2 trade routes linked Idria to the rest of Europe, and they were so rudimentary that all goods had to be carried in and out by pack animals or porters, a situation that persisted until the middle of the 18th century. The discovery of Mercury in its pure form collided with these circumstances, creating both opportunity and opposition. Many local peasants were drawn away from agriculture by employment in the mines. Others supplemented their income by serving occasionally as teamsters, hauling supplies in and products out of Idria. Yet mining is an expert craft, and the need for skilled, experienced hands soon drew an immigrant population to Idria, as it did to most other mining centers in Europe and the New World. Slavic peasants and German miners stood on opposing sides of a divide that was economic and legal as well as cultural. Drawn to isolated regions by the promise of employment and compensation, miners existed in a legal vacuum until they swore an oath of obedience to the regent and his mining ordinance, which gave them not only the right to work underground, but also privileged access to markets and resources. Moreover, the state penalized local communities for obstructing or exploiting the newcomers, rack renting for housing, price gouging for food, obstruction of mining operations, refusal to serve, trade, or even associate. Distinct languages and cultures, social discrimination and exclusion all hindered the miners' efforts to obtain basic goods and services from local farms or settlements, creating tensions that increased dependence on Fenvert. Their predicament resulted not only from the difficulties posed by topography and culture, but also from those arising from the wage and work regimes that characterized extraction before the Industrial Revolution. As at other central and East Alpine mining centers, miners at Idria earned their wages under 3 distinct regimes depending on the type of work they performed. Herren or Zeitlohnarbeit earned a weekly wage. Gedinge or Akkordarbeit compensated according to a piece rate, and Lehnschaftsarbeit, subcontracted work that was less skilled and poorly paid. Time and piece rate pay proved remarkably sticky. Between 1495 and 1660, nominal wages for workers increased only twice, despite the continually rising cost of living. In consequence, workers seldom earned enough to pay the prices they were charged for Fenvert, forcing them to assume debt or to seek by employment. The Lehnschaft offered exactly that, an opportunity to supplement wages. A miner would collect a group of workers, often family members or disabled colleagues, and pay a fee to the local agent for the privilege of extracting mercury and cinnabar from a specific slag heap or mine shaft for a specific period of time. The Lehnschaft provided the tools and labor and committed to selling whatever it produced exclusively to the local agent at a contractually fixed price. This arrangement allowed the local agent to expand the mine's production at little cost or risk, and enabled underpaid miners and their families to supplement their income. For that reason, miners complained bitterly about the corrupt assignment and high price of Lehnschaft, and another alternative to money that should have been available to all. Inconsistent, not to say unjust earnings had to do with work as well as wage regimes. The 1580 Mine Ordinance established maximum work periods of 8 hours per day and 44 hours per week, a limit that rose to 48 hours at the mid-17th century without a corresponding increase in pay. Yet not the law of the land, but the toxicity of mercury set the real limit at Idria. According to a report submitted to the State Council in 1561, quote, "A miner could not work underground for more than 14 days, but had regularly to be shifted from one form of labor to another," close quote, to avoid the permanent effects of mercury toxicity. The seasonality and marketability of production also influenced the type and period of work performed. Miners changed between work above ground in summer to work below ground in winter, the specific tasks of which were remunerated at their own rates and in their own forms, over time, by piece or at risk, and could alter earnings as much as 30% per week. Regardless of the season, they worked more intensely when the local agent had orders to produce specific amounts of mercury and cinnabar for sale and delivery at a specific time. The result was batch production, which could impose periods without any pay whatsoever. Miners worked irregularly, not according to the rhythm of a fixed number of hours or days per day or days per week, but according to the season of the year, the state of their health, and the demand for their product. How were they to visit weekly retail markets that occurred at fixed times on fixed days, such as the one at Bischofloch? How were they to know what they earned apart from what the administrators and foremen told them? Unless they kept detailed accounts of their own, how long and at which tasks, miners were completely in the dark. So their dependence on the Fenwert trade and the opportunities for chicanery grew. That those opportunities were seized frequently does not, however, prove that predatory capitalists and indifferent officials were free agents. They too were caught up in an ecology of work over which they had only partial control. They could not completely rely on laborers who were not completely dependent. Those peasants who volunteered their services as teamsters, for example, occasionally proved unwilling to work. They soon learned that the volume of Fenwert they transported to Idria far exceeded the volume of Mercury they transported away, but the rates they received for Fenwert were far lower. The peasant teamsters responded by demanding increases, and when these were not forthcoming, by refusing to work and withholding their pack animals. All attempts by local landlords, merchant capitalists, or state agents to compel them yielded no permanent solution. This resulted in frequent food shortages in Idria and sharpened conflicts surrounding the Fenwert that owners and operators provided. That state and capital proved unable either to cajole or to compel consistent compliance on the part of local peasants signals in turn the limitations of their powers and the ambiguities of their interests with regard to mining at Idria. Until the middle of the 17th century, the settlement had no local marketplace of its own. Various proposals to create a weekly commodity market for the provisioning of miners and other wage earners fell on deaf ears. The State Council decided that a regular market would not sustain itself given the geographic isolation at Idria. The regent feared that a weekly market would threaten his revenue. Those private individuals or companies that offered him credit on a regular basis for the right to operate the mine or sell its mercury were often the same companies that profited from their sole control of the Fenwert trade. Not that the regent and his government gave no thought to the stable provisioning of its miners. When the state assumed direct control of production in 1575, it took the trade in Fenwert out of the hands of the operators and their local agent. Up to that point, they had simply ignored miner protests and state admonitions. The miners were too dependent, and the government in Graz was too distant, resulting in relative impunity for violators. Moreover, many of the violators were themselves substantial landowners, political favorites, or high officials, enabling them to defeat or deflect state initiatives with regard to Idria. Nor did the situation improve under state control. It merely reappointed the operator's long-term local agent, a man by the name of Urban Einkorn, who continued decades of predation by raising the value of Fenwert so high that the miners were driven to stop work in 1579. Einkorn illustrates the difficulties posed to capital and state by alternatives to money, given the ecology of work at Idria. He assumed the role of local agent at Idria in 1549, a position he would hold uninterrupted until his retirement in 1586. At the same time, he was himself a stakeholder in the mine, an owner of the iron works that produced and repaired tools for the mine, the lord of estates that controlled the main transit routes to the mine, and a major creditor of the regent of the mine. The ability of individuals such as Einkorn to hold multiple offices and pursue individual opportunities without apparent conflict of interest long assured the continued corruption of the Fenwert trade. Einkorn's successors were no less corrupt. Minor complaints continued, minor indebtedness increased, even cash wages could not entirely protect miners from the predations of merchants and officials, often one and the same person. Local agriculture produced too little, retail markets were too distant, the Fenwert trade was indispensable. The pattern of misuse and malversation continued until 1648, when the state finally ended the Fenwert monopoly, enabling the few local retailers who had settled in Idria to provision the miners. A local market in foodstuffs and other necessities began gradually to emerge at Idria in the mid-17th century, ending the use of Fenwert as an alternative to money. Henceforth, the miners received wages in cash, paid cash for their necessities, and became indebted to local retailers rather than a foreign capitalist or a mine administrator. None of the parties involved in mercury extraction at Idria, the state, capitalists, agents, miners, peasants, wished to see the use of Fenwert as an alternative to money abandoned. It relieved miners of the arduous, sometimes impossible task of provisioning at marketplaces that were too distant, occasionally hostile, and frequently untimely. It stabilized the workforce and fostered a degree of order that generated revenue and lowered costs to the state, and of course, it provided capitalists with opportunities for profit. As ruthless and self-interested as this practice could be, it was also a rational consequence of the local ecology of work that had certain advantages for all. This paper has concentrated attention on Fenwert, foodstuffs, textiles, tools, and other supplies offered in lieu of cash wages. In an age of commodity money, it makes sense that any alternative to money would likewise take the form of commodities, but they were not the only alternatives in use. Mining involved different forms of interlocking and interacting alternatives to money that functioned at all levels of the political economy. Almost as frequently as miners complained about the corrupt distribution of Fenwert, they objected to the misuse of Leinschaften. The miners of Idria valued it, as I've said, because it provided a form of by-employment, a chance to increase earnings in times of stagnant wages or full unemployment. Hence, the Leinschaft offered, more, insofar as the holder of a Leinschaft became an entrepreneur and foreman in his own right, he gained status as well as opportunity. Even in an age of commodity money, intangibles as well as tangibles, fixed as well as variable capital, could serve as alternatives. As this paper has tried to suggest, the use of alternatives to money penetrated all levels of the political economy of mercury extraction at Idria. A cash-strapped state offered alternatives as an incentive to service. It provided secure tenure to peasants in return for their labor services and agricultural productivity. It offered material inducements to miners in return for their skilled artisanship. It granted political autonomy to landlords in return for their administrative and military services. It awarded legal privilege and monopoly protection to merchant capitalists in return for financial and commercial service. All of these inducements functioned as alternatives to money in situations where cash might otherwise have changed hands. And all of these inducements, whether in the form of privileges or opportunities, status or authority, incomes or interest, generated monetary value for the parties involved. At Idria, an entire exchange economy can be said to have functioned based on alternatives to money. Indeed, they made that economy possible. As the name implies, alternatives find use in those moments when different media of exchange and different metrics of value become essential, because money will not serve. The existence of alternatives indicates that even in a monetized economy, money is neither the only nor the best medium of exchange in all circumstances. Thank you.
Grazie tante, professore.
Thank you, Professor. The next speaker will be Professor Giulio Ongaro and Luca Mocarelli from Milano Bicocca University about Northern Italy. Please.
La tecnologia. Funziona?
Sì, penso di sì. Proviamo a vedere. Vediamo cosa succede.
Va bene.
Sì, funziona.
Va bene.
Grazie mille, innanzitutto. Come dice il titolo dell'intervento, noi ci proponiamo di approfondire la caratterizzazione e il ruolo svolto dai pagamenti in natura nei salari sia in città che in campagna nell'Italia settentrionale nel Settecento. Molto brevemente, questa sarà un po' la scaletta della presentazione, quindi dopo aver visto l'importanza di includere la parte in natura nell'analisi dei salari, vi mostreremo brevemente quali sono i casi di studio e le fonti, quindi ci sarà una parte più quantitativa, possiamo dire, del paper in cui cercheremo di fornire alcuni dati, alcune stime sull'incidenza in termini di valore della parte in natura sul totale del salario, appunto sia in città che in campagna, sia per quanto riguarda i lavoratori giornalieri che quelli stabili, specializzati e non specializzati, e quindi andremo a vedere se c'è una variazione nel corso del tempo della parte in natura.
And if there is any change dealing with the kind of employment and especially the wage level. This will allow us to understand the contribution provided by this kind of payment in meeting primary needs of workers. So in short, the incidence of the in-kind side on the purchasing power of workers.
A questa parte seguirà poi una parte più qualitativa.
And then we will also deal with the quality of products, their quality vis-à-vis the comparison, dealing with the comparison between commodities and the price market of the very same products. And then we will try and use this kind of reflection to try and see how a possible review of these computation systems, including the in-kind payment, can be useful whenever we deal with the standards and therefore all the theories connected to it. By considering the role played by the in-kind payment and other features of the pre-industrial period market, like, and we will try to have this kind of consideration in a wider scenario. So very shortly, why is it important to speak about the amount of the in-kind payment or in-kind wages? There is nothing new in historiography. At least in Italy, starting from the 80s, the idea has been forgotten about non-monetary transactions being the symptom of backwardness in a process of monetization of economy. The problem is that beyond this kind of reflection or consideration, if we go and see the papers vis-à-vis wages and the amount of wage levels, even in the short term, we think of Allen, and for Italy we have Malanima. Paving the way for very important debate on divergence, etc. This reflection has always been based on data collection, considering the side, the money side of wages. Therefore, the awareness of in-kind payment, this consideration has been set apart. But before moving ahead, I would like to shortly define what we mean by a non-monetary side of wages, a set of elements. I mean, all these products, different kinds of foodstuffs and non-foodstuffs that are providing and forming both the monetary side of wages, the daily remuneration, workers with a longer-term contract, as well as piecework. And then we have the payment of fringe benefits that would be both in-kind and money during festivities, and then food and lodging providing to workers of employers. These components are very difficult to find in the documentation, and it is difficult to quantify them, and this is the reason why they are frequently left aside from any attempt to quantify this. Showing that with this kind of presentation, we provide some estimates. We provide some general indications, knowing that these estimates are just rough, because it is not always easy, especially when we speak of some specific wage components like food and lodging. It is not easy to find any indication on the value of such components, and it is not easy to sum them up and to reach some overall amount. Which means that the data we're going to provide have been calculated, but lower than what they really are. But the in-kind side of the wage is even higher than what we propose. So what have we used for such kind of estimate? Our analysis starts or deals essentially with two areas in northern Italy, both the city and county of Bologna and Padova. And then in my paper, we will also mention the Milano area. These two provinces belong to two different states, and for those areas, we have collected data about urban and rural workers, fixed-term and daily workers, with different kinds of workers, not just bricklayers in the rural setting or peasants, but we have also tried to go beyond and to see and to go into depth vis-à-vis their remuneration. They have different farming. We have sharecropping in Bologna, and we have lease and a small lease of plots in Padova area. And this allows us to compare some contexts, different contexts. The data collected from the accounting books, the ecclesiastical institutions, we have also charitable institutions, an accounting of noble families, therefore landowners. This accounting is really different, allowing us to go into the money remuneration as well as quantifying what was being given to workers, both as a wage component as well as donation and food and lodging. In the urban setting, we have collected data considering household payment to doctors, accountants, and laborers. And as for the rural, we have laborers, we have rural workers, bricklayers in the countryside, as well as the stewards, therefore more qualified staff. We have money payment as well as those dealing with bread, wine, wages being paid with wood, grain, etc. What about the in-kind component of the wage? We are proposing the percentage of the value of the in-kind part on the overall value of the wage, including wages as well as lodging in the for the different kind of workers. We are proposing an average of all the occupations throughout the 18th century. Therefore, you see that this is a rather general view that is using the market value of the products the worker was receiving. You may disagree with this kind of approach. Also, coming from the idea of providing some indications of how the workers would have to spend to have these products, hadn't they received them as part of their wage. You see that as for the countryside, we have two estimates which have been made, considering that the one received was pure wine and in the otherwise was half wine. I'm not reporting. There is some debate on what was being used, but the documentation seems to show pure wine, but it is not always specified. That's why we decided to provide two different estimates. What do these estimates suggest? First of all, the importance of the in-kind part on the overall wage, both in Bologna and Padua area. They also say that the in-kind payment was higher in the countryside than in the city. and it was higher for stable workers as compared with daily laborers. And the same applies to other areas in the country. These data are part of a wider consideration. As for the percentage level of the wage composition, the in-kind wage composition are in line with Mauro Rotta's and Jacopo Weisdorf for the Italian countryside. Therefore, more or less, these are the values. Let's see what happens throughout the 18th century. As I said, this is an overall view. If we look at the evolution of the in-kind composition, for urban workers, we didn't find any relevant change. There is some substantial stability in the percentage, but in the countryside, as you see, in the countryside, the percentage of in-kind payment vis-à-vis the overall remuneration is changing, both in Bologna and Padova. This is due not so much to an increase of products or foods or products given to workers, but the higher incidence of the in-kind component in the countryside following inflation to be found in Italy, especially in the second half of the 18th century. And if we look at the value of products, this provides an overall increase. You see the first difference among the different kinds of employment, but in general, they have been summarized, some of them according to the kind of work, but not all workers doing the same work received the same wage. The wage was the result of a negotiation, therefore levels would change. But how is the percentage changing? I mean, the in-kind component, how is it changing? This is the result. This is what comes from our analysis. You see that, in general, we have an increase in the wage, followed by the reduction of the percentage of the in-kind component. This is providing some quantitative data. Okay, let's go and see what was being given to workers or laborers and the impact of each product vis-à-vis the composition or the in-kind composition of the wage. First of all, the difference or the differentiation between stable and daily workers that we have seen in terms of percentage does not only concern percentages, but also the composition of what the employers gave to work or laborers. In short, we see that bricklayers and laborers received what was needed for their level of immediate subsistence. Therefore, essentially, one sometimes bread. Servants, treasurers, governors, and stewards, they received some products and some different kinds of products. Here you have a few examples vis-à-vis the two different contexts analyzed. You see that both grain and wine are the main products in the consumption basket. Either grain or bread or wine, and there were products or baking the bread, but then we have wood, olive oil. As for the daily laborers in Bologna, received between 7 to 10% of their remuneration in wine. It is very interesting. We have been looking at the data vis-à-vis Fabbrica di San Petronio laborers. Wine was given exactly in percentage of the monetary wage. Therefore, 7 to 10% is what is being reported as the amount given to bricklayers. In the countryside, we know that laborers received between 4 to 7 liters of wine a day, and sometimes bread. But it seems that bread is disappearing throughout the 18th century as a product given to workers. As for Padova area, even in this case, it is about 5 liters of wine every day. It can be pure or half wine, therefore it is 50% less. This data about wine allow us to think about a very important topic, whether this payment would be used for personal use or for a larger use at a family level for the household, or maybe for selling on the market. Apart from wine, this is a question that we can ask about ourselves vis-à-vis the other products given to laborers. It is too much for personal consumption, even if we think that the personal use of wine is higher than what can be seen. It would be probably 1 liter and not, or half liter, even less. Anyway, these figures are still high, and the same applies for bread, grain, or wheat that was being given to human workers. This means that probably the in-kind side would go beyond or would exceed the needs of the single workers. I'd like to go back to what Rothways wrote on rural wages. The in-kind side or the in-kind percentage is completing what the monetary side cannot buy in the basket needed for the living of workers. This can be open to discussion because the in-kind part is fully covering, at least for this kind of product, which are the staple products. This fully meets the needs of workers or the food basket and even part of that of his family. Okay, so far we have seen what was being given and how this would affect the wage according to the market value of products. This does not mean, but we still know that the products received by workers would have a different value as compared with market prices. And even in some cases, there are indications that are debating the quality of the products given. It is not always easy to say what they would receive, but we do have some indication in the archives. As for wine, whether half or pure wine, apart from this kind of debate, wine together with water, in the accounting papers of households, we sometimes find we see that workers would receive old wine or even vinegar. This has been written. As for bread, in the city, documents about the city are rather clear. Wheat-made bread, but in the countryside, the situation is more complex. First of all, because in this period, maize or corn becomes one of the main foodstuffs in a farming diet, and therefore this kind of remuneration might show this kind of cereal. But actually, what seems to come out is that wheat bread would be given in the countryside, but probably mixed bread with, wheat mixed with other minor cereals. But even in this case, besides the composition, we also have the problem of composition. And documents sometimes show that laborers receive the leftovers of these wheat production, a lower quality bread. I mean, leftovers. We have also tried to see and to consider the value. I mean, the documentation shows the value which is being given to the wheat given to laborers. We have tried to compare it with these with the prices. I mean, the market price of wheat, and we have seen that. I mean, to summarize, we have seen that the value of the wheat given to laborers is 6 to 7% lower. It is not easy to try and see what this means. It can also mean that for employers the value was lower because there was no brokerage cost, and this would represent the market price. Therefore, this lower price affecting what the worker was receiving. It is questionable. I'd like to finish up with some reflection vis-à-vis this kind of reflection which has been proposed and how this can affect the debate on the living standard. First of all, we can say that the in-kind composition of the wage would be a large part, with a very important impact for both for fixed-term workers and for daily laborers. It would frequently cover or meet 100% of the needs of both of the workers and of the family, and part of the needs of the family. Therefore, it was not just completing the money side of the remuneration. The effect on the purchasing power of workers is more difficult to understand, because the in-kind side of the wage is frequently associated with a larger safety for vis-à-vis fluctuation of prices, because what was being taken for granted was that fixed amounts would be given, and therefore laborers would receive the same quantity of the product all over again. But actually it is not the case, because sometimes in-kind composition would correspond to fixed amount of monetary value. Therefore, the amount of bread and wine would change accordingly. But in other cases, the issue is even more complicated, because, for example, in Bologna, in the countryside, laborers would receive a fixed amount of bread, but they would receive a loaf of bread, and the loaf of bread, considering this annona system, would change in weight. So even when the amount of the product seems to be fixed, there is actually a change. Besides that, we can say that, in general terms, in-kind payment would concern fixed amounts of products. Therefore, they would play an important role in reducing the price fluctuations that would affect laborers. So the limitation of, considering that it is associated with the fact that the annona institutions would act in the same way, we are publishing an article, and the annona institutions would provide some 30% reduction of price fluctuations of commodity baskets. If we sum up these two elements, we can understand that in general, this functioning of the market, going beyond wages and in-kind wages, this system was working to try and stabilize the so-called purchasing power of workers. Thank you.
Faccio il portavoce.
I don't know, shall we take a break? 30 minutes break? What do you suggest? Shall we break now for 30 minutes? Okay, let's break the session now. 30 minutes coffee break.
Buongiorno. Buongiorno.
Hello, welcome back again. So we start our session again. After this short break, we have two papers, we have two presentations this morning after the coffee break. The first will be delivered by Michela Barbot from Paris University, and she's going to talk about payment date, theory and praxis, contractual theory and praxis in Italy and France from modern age onwards. Quand vous voulez, when you want. Can you hear me? I have my slides. I prepared some slides in mine. So good morning, anyone. I hope there is no echo in the room, no echoing. My presentation is about the payment date, which is a term of payment going back to Roman law, also used in many European codifications today. It's not a relic from the past, but still existing today. So that's a variant of datio insolutum. During my presentation, I will speak payment date comparing Italy versus Italy and France from the survey of three major sources. Theories made up by the experts of civil law, norms made by legislators, some examples of contractual and legal practice recorded by notaries, fiscal administrators, and law courts. We have to say that the availability of Italian sources is much higher than the French ones. This comparison is very asymmetric. I'm not speaking more than Italy than France. It depends on the available sources. If in the contemporary France, payment date has turned out to be a quite used tool to pay off debts, and also a key tool to enrich museum collections. Now you have an example of Vermeer of 668 that has been acquired by Louvre thanks to a payment date of the Rothschild succession. So this was not the case in previous centuries for some reasons I'm going to show. This was considered, above all, by legislators and jurists with some, skepticism, even though with some deal of interest. The contrary applies to the Italian situation. This was quite common in the centuries of the old regime, and then has been decreased in importance, even if the civil code uses it with these quotation, performance in terms of fulfillment. Datum insolutum is stable from the chronological viewpoint. Its main traits remain unchanged since the Roman epoch. Negotio, which is celebrated in order to open, instead of open the contractual relationship. Datio insolutum is one of the real legal forms of performance, aliud pro pallio, because it's in line with the principle, once an agreement has been set up, no contractor can change his idea and must honor the obligations. Even though in the Roman sources with different forms of dating, thing versus thing, performance versus performance, etc., res pro pecunia is the most common one thing in place of money. So payment date is a deed, a debtor is fulfilling the monetary obligation given a commodity instead of money which is due. So the cessation must be fruitful, but we have three requirements to meet. That must be in pecunia munerata, translating into money. Insolutum is of the debtor. You cannot give something belonging to somebody else. There must be traditio. This must be a passage of property, a material passage of these things, from debtors to creditors, and legally stable and also fit. Creditor must have his credit, and the debtor has to give the commodity. Between the Seicento and Settecento, the French jurists look at the importance of this way of payment, also considering the benefits of this way of payment. First, contractual benefit. So civil law, under certain conditions, allows parties to modify a convention by mutual agreement. This modification seems to extend the obligation, whereas dating date is a useful way out when you want to get rid of a contractual, bond. Problematic, you don't like it anymore. From the economic level, we have more advantages because considering some money shortage or overdue payments, risk of insolvency or bankruptcy, the dazione insolutum has the advantage to get rid of any stoppage of the economic life and financial life. Even though we are aware of these opportunities, civilists also stress some critical points, provoking some alteration of the initial path. Dazione insolutum raises problems for justice, trust, and stability, and safety of exchanges. Also, putting at stake the equivalence between the contractual performances, so we have to do something as to prices, a sort of comparison between the due money and things given, the value of the given things. Even though this is done in a similar way, these problems are faced and solved in a partially different way in France and in Italy. As to France, instead, on the wake of the theory of the natural right or natural law by Dumas and Potier, forerunners of the civil code in France, theory considering the equivalent performance as a main principle, and the idea of commutative justice. So the French jurists stress the analogy between datio and the model of a perfectly balanced symmetric agreement contract, which is the sale. Sale is an obsession of the French jurists. That's a mantra in all the treatises of civil law. Dating for sale is also considered in many civil law dictionaries and in the jurisprudence collection. As to the dating, this is very focused on their times. They don't say anything as to dating, showing this is not evoking case history or case studies for special consideration. If the dictionary of Ferrier, in its different editions, is not useful, the case law Dio, at the end of the 18th century, confines itself to reiterate this analogy, as you can see from these abstracts. The dating is a sale, dare insolutum est vende. The idea of some equivalence between these two contracts has another quite important consequence, because the French jurists recognize one single form of this way of payment, which is a voluntary, by mutual consent, qualifying the fourth mandatory one as something very exceptional. The origin of this distinction goes back to the Roman law and can be found in a Justiniano tale, the fourth, speaking of a real benefit for debtors. Dazione insolutum is something real benefit for the debtor, in favor of debtors. And that's a way of satisfaction not requiring the mutual consent among parties. But this can also be imposed by the judge to help those who cannot pay their dues, not selling their commodities, their assets, without running the risk of having their price reduced. Very often they speak the Justinianus tale. The French juries do not speak of the transaction. Dating is just in favor of debtors. This date is totally foreign from the principle of freedom. Against the Roman law, these authors defend the idea that the creditor is not obliged to receive in payment a commodity if he doesn't want to, even though this commodity is even higher than his debt. Unless the creditor is not saying, okay, it's all right, give me a commodity instead of money. So any kind of commodities can be given as a payment, so tangible or intangible. As to the estimate procedures to make these equivalents, the French jurists agree on the point I'm going to show you now, and this has also been confirmed by the Italians. This way is included in voluntary obligations. The fixation of value is just open to the parties involved. Law cannot say anything about the ways. The party will decide by mutual consent to set up the value of a commodity. A totally different standing seems to be contemplated in the Italian situation. The dazione solution gives rise to some monographic volumes, publications for this kind of issue. You see two examples, Novaro and Giussano, and I will be speaking of these two soon. They propose a rich review of cases of case law showing the great spread of this way of payment for Italian jurists. Even though most of them once again stress the opportunity of considering that as a real sale, this nexus is less strong than in France. Well, what's more interesting, Italian jurists, they recognize the mandatory variant imposed by the judge. Also continue the idea of the need of giving debtors a shortcut, a way out, not just to pay their dues, to avoid the confiscation of their commodities or sold at a public auction. These different situations as some legal repercussions. What about the legislators? The French coutume in the regions of droit coutumier, customary law, they're just in line with the civilists. They just say the payment date is taken into account as well. Also, we got some tax consequences, and they recognize the voluntary use of it as an exemption, as a transitory remedy for traumatic events, warfare, pandemic, subsistence crisis, a strong economic recession. When the emergency is cleared out, we have to go backwards. So very different scenarios also in Italy where the regional statutes and municipal statutes. So speak of these in a broader way. Even the measures adopted are partially different from one situation to the other. A common issue, which is very often considered, is the legal claim of debts contracted by merchants and bankers in their activities. Just to mention these operators to make money run, circulate, which is one important part of their work. Most statutes ask the traders, debtors, to pay their dues in pecunia numerata. Rejected by many mercantile tribunals, the possibility of leaving a commodity is also used in the praxis. This is shown by Renata Agora in her study on the 16th century Rome, mentioning this session in solution is the main way to large merchants to make payments of a certain importance. The issue of the indebtedness level is key, starting from which threshold indebtedness legal authorize or less. Most statutes exclude these for debts lower than a certain amount, also for the first use commodities or consumption, commodities, so the rents. if a debtor didn't pay the rent of his house with other instruments, but is not obliged to give something in exchange. So the threshold varies a lot according to the background to take into account. Another important point is the nature of commodities which can be given. What can you give in payment? If the general rules forbids the use of these agreement debts between merchants and bankers, they must be used currency. And when the value of the buildings is not good to cover up the sum, the rule is more stringent, and it's the extent that she does. So the real estate cession is only authorized by the prince. Extrema ratio. If this production given to the buildings, land buildings, is done according to their function of a manufacturing factor for lands, this protection is also possible in the nexus, very strong, connecting property, land properties to the right of citizenship. In most Italian states, the detention of a real right, the right on something, on movable property, is key to be a citizen through residency. Each mechanism which can make the property rights run is very much controlled by local authorities for this nexus. For this reason, dating is a benefit which is reserved almost to the subjects, to inhabitants of the state in question, where a foreigner, not being having some insolvency, he has just to pay. So selling his commodities in order to get their commodities be confiscated, sold by public auction. Also in Italy, the alio pro alio, one thing for the other, is giving important problems of justice and stability of these agreements. The Italian legislators do not hide for these problems, and they do this frontally, trying to neutralize this problem when they speak of prices and cost estimates. Between the thing and the money. One special case, well documented, in the case of Duchy of Milan, the Dazio in Paga covers 1/5 of property transfers on the urban real estate market, and its use doubles during the 1620s, 30s crisis. I made some calculation about the urban real estate, so the Dazio, dato in paga, can cover 1/5 of property transfers on the urban real estate market between the 1600 and years after. And this percentage increases with the financial turmoil and the financial crisis of the 20s, during which the spread of this way of payment doubles in intensity after the problem of liquidity and also difficulties in paying one's dues. We use a Dazio in solutum in a more intense way. Giulio Cesare Giussani, a civil judge belonging to the College of the Judges in Duchy of Milan, published 2 treatises, monographic treatises, one on the estimate procedures and the other on Dazio in solutum, showing the strong link between these 2 issues, but also the red line connecting these 2 topics. The same red line is found in the statutes. From a series of articles of new constitutions in Milano, Charles V. So the commodity estimate is tackled after the Dazio in solutum. What these norms say. So this confirms the Dazio in solutum is a benefit granted to the debtor. So the debtor has a time window of 1 year to redeem the goods, to rebuy these goods at the same price when these goods were given to the creditor. 1 year time to find the money to have these commodities back. The price is reduced at 2/3 of the true value of the goods. That's the duty. Once the true value of the goods has been done, we have to reduce it. That's what occurs also. Once again, very, very, very quick. A quite emblematic case. The Palazzo Marini, which is the headquarters of the City Hall in Milan, in 1577, by the heirs of the Genoa banker, gave this building to the city of Milan. And among the heirs, we have the nun of Monza, the supposed to be nun of Monza in Manzoni. These heirs have to pay. And so the building will be used as a payment. Tommaso Marina adds a lot of debt. And so, as the study shows, the value has been reduced by 2/3, the value which was the real value. But what's the real value of goods? So, instead of shading the real value, the Statius and Giussani, the judge, they show a long set of proceedings to follow in order to get real value of goods. In the voluntary, but also in the mandatory case, the real value of goods must be fixed and must be certified by a public evaluator, so belonging to the guild of a mean junk dealer, or to the College of Architects and also land surveyors in case of real estate properties. And the real value must be also done in writing and ultimately refer to the value of the goods at the time and at the place when the debt was originated. And so we have a real investigation, quite complex, in order to gather, the evidence to attach at the dating deed. All these evidence must be annexed. The estimated value is not to be a sort of it's not to take into account the subjective value or the affection-like value commodities have for individuals, creditors of debtors, above all debtors, but this real value must be based on the intrinsic value, so the production cost of these assets, of this commodity. So it's also possible to have some extrinsic correction, so the price of similar goods when they are sold in the local real estate market. But in case of mala tempora, in bad times, this possibility is not taken into account, and we have to go back to the intrinsic value, which is more stable, the more certain, and as Giussani said, anyone agrees upon this value. To finish off with these estimates, we have some additional rules explain how to make the inventory, the main tool, to understand the order to give to the goods, to give as a payment, and also have to see the date indeed. We have a lot of rules. In addition to these, evaluators can also use the estimate methods being formulated in parallel in many estimate manuals circulating in Italy, starting from the end of the Middle Ages for the entire modern age. In the 19th century, there will be a discipline all architects hate, the cadastre estimate. So very interesting to know that these corpus of rules and procedures, instead of witnessing the link between private and public, shows the function as a guarantor for debtors and creditors, because in different steps, the procedure is offering the possibility of evoking some formal problems, and also to reconsider the term of the dating. So that's a process. So what happens in a long trial? I have no time to speak of this trial. This will be done by me in the final test. Long dating process for 1 century and a half. This is lasting 1 century and a half. John Tomasi Carenzi, debtor to the state of Milan. So his heirs. Dating goes on beyond the lifetime of these people, of this man, of this debtor. I'm coming to my end. Just to finish this off, the comparison between the Italian and the French case shows quite well the legal ways, institutional ways of regulating this way of payment. This is showing two different forms of moral economy and two different strategy of financial and economic policy. The first, the French one, more inclined to protect the creditor, the debtors. The debtors are guilty, so to be blamed, to be formally within the background of contractual commutative justice. So the second one, the Italian one, is more inclined to help debtors, not creditors, as the previous one. To avoid the debt can produce some snowball effect, and also very much focus in mitigating this imbalance to these bonds, with the same legitimacy to negotiate from scratch the way of payment without putting in jeopardy this new way of payment, considering always the contractual justice. Contractual justice is interpreted as a mixture, commutative and distributive, and not just commutative. Equivalence of performance right, but also the point it's a debtor, and this debtor has a strong position within the political community. Identity of the parties, not the equivalence of the exchange. This plays in Italy a role which is pivotal. Thank you.
Grazie Michela. Allora parlerà il professor Robert Braid.
Professor Braid will be the next speaker from Montpellier, and he will tell us about alternative forms of remuneration in medieval Europe.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm very sorry that I have not participated more often in these past 14 years. I've been doing something very radical. I've been teaching economics a lot, and I've not been studying very much medieval economic history. And I've discovered quite a number of things when I look at what we teach economics students relative to what we see when we look in the sources and we look at economic data. And so what I wanted to do today was to present some findings. And the paper that I will present was inspired by a paper that I saw here 14 years ago by Professor John Monroe, who presented a paper on sticky wages. And unfortunately, it has taken me this long to come up with a response. And unfortunately, he is no longer with us to comment, and I'm sure he would very much comment on what I have to say. So I'm counting on all of you, please, in the spirit of John Monroe, please point out where you think I may be going wrong. Because I'm very curious as to what really is the situation, because I'm still rather perplexed. So basically, sticky wages. Many of us talk about sticky wages. In economics, the idea of sticky wages means that nominal wages, the cash amount that one receives, the number, will not decline. They tend to go up slowly, not as quickly as prices at some times, but they refuse to go down. All right, this is the idea of sticky wages, and this is a very, very important subject in economics because of this phenomena that is taken as some sort of natural phenomena in economics, has an impact on real wages or the standards of living or the purchasing power of workers, because in periods of deflation, workers have more purchasing power because their wages will not go down. However, when prices go up in periods of inflation, obviously, they have less purchasing power, as we notice today in this period of inflation. It is also very important because it is seen by economists as the source of unemployment. Because in economic downturns, the prices are going down, and employers, because for whatever reason they cannot, because of this phenomena of sticky wages, they cannot reduce wages, they end up having to lay off workers. And so they will keep a small group of highly productive workers, and they will lay off the less productive workers. So sticky wages is a very important question in economics, because it's the reason for the standards of living of workers, and it is the cause of unemployment. And in the economics, the standard text that we use in economics in American universities, in any case, that was written by Samuelson and re-edited by Nordhaus, it is considered one of the deepest unresolved issues of economic analysis still today. So what I'd like to do is to talk about this question of sticky wages. And I will go do a brief literature review of what economists say, and then what historians have to say, the ones who looked at the data. And I'm going to ask the question, were wages actually sticky? And if they were, why? Is it because of the forms of remuneration? Is it because of legislation that blocked them? I'm going to look at the 14th century in particular because it is a great example of a regime change. So there was the Black Death, and there was a major economic upheaval, and it is also the period during which there was a lot of legislation that was introduced to fix wages. So it's a very good test case to see how do wages react. So I will look at a number of documents. I will look at, in particular, the account registers of Marseille, which is a wonderful source of data, but it's very, very complex. We have account registers from before the Black Death and from after the Black Death, but the accounting practices changed dramatically before and afterwards, so it's quite difficult to compare the data from before and afterwards. And I will look for examples of sticky wages and for payments in kind. And I will also look at, and in the paper I look a lot at the labor regulations, because the regulators, very often we will see comment about what is going on the markets and how is the economic behavior of the agents, the economic agents, how is that changing because of the regulations. And spoiler, I will tell you already that my conclusions are that nominal wages were absolutely not sticky before the Black Death, these agricultural wages in particular, and that once labor legislation was introduced, and there were also new employment practices such as outsourcing that tended to stabilize wages either in reality or how we perceive it in the account registers, which is not always actually how things were practiced. And there are alternative forms of remuneration, can add liquidity in markets once the wages, the cash wages, are fixed by law, but it was not always the case, and we'll try to see why. Okay, so a quick overview of what economists have to say. Anybody who's taught a course in economics, we all talk about sticky wages. Wages are sticky, and so I looked at the literature about this question. At what point do economists start mentioning that wages were sticky? And I looked at the classical literature between Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and Marshall, and other than one rare observation that was actually cited by Professor Monroe, but it was very, very exceptional, almost all of them recognize that wages are volatile. They are negotiated up, they are negotiated down according to supply, demand, and the needs of the market. Karl Marx, in fact, is very well known for arguing that employers negotiate nominal wages very, very low, restricting the purchasing power of the workers, which is causing crises of overproduction and a decrease in aggregate demand. So, and Marshall as well Alfred Marshall, highlight the fact that these wages can fluctuate according to the sale price that employers can find. So I haven't found until the early 20th century, I haven't found economists who actually mentioned that wages were sticky. There's only one sentence in Adam Smith that I've found, and it was simply to show how English workers are so much better off than the workers in China. It wasn't really an observation of how things were taking place on the market. It started with Irving Fisher, who pointed out that workers are suffering from the money illusion, right? Workers don't understand, in fact, that in an economic downturn, prices are going down, so it's okay that they take a wage cut because their purchasing power will remain buoyant. So it's something that they just don't understand. They're suffering from the money illusion, and so they tend to resist a reduction in nominal wages. And we have this literature that workers tend to resist wage cuts. John Maynard Keynes is very well known for his observations of how psychology affect the animal spirits, how they affect market trends. And he argues that workers are encouraged by slowly increased nominal wages, and that he does seem to notice that there are sticky wages, and that they create actually sticky prices in certain sectors. Joan Robinson was very adamant about saying it's the fault of the trade unions that resist, and the more the workers are organized, the stickier the wages. And this actually leads to inflation, what economists today would call a wage price spiral. As workers want higher wages, it pushes prices higher. As prices get higher, workers will demand higher wages. And John Hicks also mentioned, these are all the greats of the early 20th century economics, it is perhaps a question of efficiency. It's easier to offer a standard rate to all of the workers. But he did also mention the fact that workers tend to resist. And it was only the case starting at the late 19th century when there were actually unions to be able to resist the downward pressure by employers. So there's this trend in the literature in economics that it's the fault of the workers. They refuse to accept wage cuts, which according to some would be ridiculous. They should in times of deflation. There are others who fault the government, obviously. Arthur Pigou, contemporary of Keynes, says it was wage regulations have a tendency to block wages and not allow them to fall. Schumpeter, he doesn't cite wage regulation in particular. He just says any intervention of the government has a tendency to make things rigid. Obviously, he's much more in favor of creative destruction and let the economy collapse and it will regenerate itself naturally. And he seems to take two small examples, a recession of 1920-21, and then the Great Depression, and he says the Great Depression lasted so long because the government intervened. So the government is intervening and causing sticky wages and not allowing the economy to recover. Starting in the 1950s, there are other ones that mention the minimum wage regulations, which makes sense because there were no minimum wage regulations before the 1930s in the United States, 1908 in Britain. And so George Stigler and Milton Friedman are blaming the government. Obviously, it's the fault of the government for fixing wages, and this is preventing the economy from adjusting naturally. As the economy through the 20th century tended to become less industrialized, at least in the countries where these economists are working, they tend to focus on other factors. It's more the psychological effects. And so Kenneth Galbraith is interested more into the question of why are wages so low. It's for fear. So the workers fear when there's a high level of unemployment, they fear being flushed into the reserve of the unemployed. And so that is enabling employers to push wages down, so not actually noticing sticky wages. Stiglitz and Shapiro use very theoretical models to demonstrate how, theoretically, of course, unemployment, high levels of unemployment, can be used as a discipline tool for workers to keep their wages relatively low. But in periods of low unemployment, they have to offer higher wages to prevent shirking. And so there are a certain number of other ones. Janet Yellen, who's everybody knows quite now, is on the front and center on the stage in the United States. It's for questions of efficiency. If we pay workers more, they will go up. If we pay workers less, they will become less efficient, and they will tend to shirk their responsibilities. And so the phenomena of shirking. And Akerlof, who is married to Janet Yellen, also is interested in this question of psychology, and this drive for fairness is preventing employees from accepting lower wages. They find that it is not fair and it will affect their output. And so this is why wages tend not to go down. There are never wage cuts, but they can increase relatively slowly. And Bewley actually led in interviews of people in the 1990s to see why it was the case. And indeed, he found that employers feared affecting the productivity of the workers. What I've noticed is that there's a particular chronology. Before World War I, none of the economists seemed to even notice that wages were sticky. Starting in the early 20th century, they were sticky, according to these theoretical economists. And it was because of trade unions in particular, who refused to accept wage cuts. After the Depression, when they were introducing wage regulations and minimum wage laws, it was the fault of the government. And now that the economy is much further from these minimum wage industrialized jobs, they focus more on psychology. So they don't seem to agree on why wages are sticky, but I will point out that none of these actually cite the data. If we look at the economists who actually cite the data and look in the account registers and don't rely on purely economic models, I found three in particular, Commons, Kuznets, and Dunlop, who show an incredible flexibility in labor practices. Only in certain circumstances where there were particular regulations or where there were particularly strong unions, there was a tendency to stabilize wages, but generally on the economy that is not the case. Simon Kuznets talked about the relative skill level and in certain sectors. So, and this is very important, if you're working for the government, or if you're working in the construction industry, wages tended to be very stable. And as we know from medieval history, a lot of our data about wages comes from the construction industry, and we should be very careful about extrapolating from one sector to another. And John Dunlop looked at different truck drivers, and their wages moved up and down, and it really depended on what product they were transporting: beer, soft drinks, magazines. So even in the same type of activity, a small difference in the type of transport would make a difference in the employment practices. And David Card recently won a Nobel Prize for actually arguing, demonstrating the data that in fact by increasing the minimum wage, we are not increasing unemployment as the theoretical models had the economists using theoretical models would like us to believe. So the economists that look at the empirical data have a tendency to show high volatility and lots of flexibility in wages. The ones that like to look mostly at theoretical models seem to argue in favor of the sticky wages. And so my question is, what do medieval historians think about wage rigidity? There are two in particular, but I'm sure we can cite quite a number of other ones, that because of this phenomena of wage rigidity, this is allowing workers to attain higher standards of living in the period at the end of the 14th century when prices were sliding for basic commodities, in particular grain. And Guy Bois makes this his main argument: why are workers living this golden era in the 15th century? And it's because of the falling grain prices and because of the phenomena of sticky wages. And he observes, theoretically, sticky wages. But when we read actually what he's looking at, he extracts the data in a particular manner where he cherry picks the data according to what he perceives as the most common wage, not the average. He doesn't look at, he takes, this one looks, so 4 shillings, for example, this looks like it's the most common wage this year, and he would take that out and say that is the wage that was offered that year, recognizing that there was a high variety of other wages that were being offered on the market, but excluding them totally from his analysis. John Monroe also argues that there was a certain golden age of workers thanks to, and he clearly states that it's because of this question of wage stickiness and declining prices that the levels of the standards of living increased dramatically in the end of the 14th and throughout the 15th century. But he bases himself on the data from Phelps Brown and Hopkins. And Phelps Brown and Hopkins, we know, also based a lot of their data from Thorold Rogers. And when we look at what these people who actually extracted the data from the archives pointed out, is that they hardly seem terribly reliable. Because Thorold Rogers thought that after the mid-14th century, because of the statutes of laborers, many employers were paying sums and then erasing them to conform with the statutes. And he was confounded. He didn't know which one to take. And so he said, well, I took the one that was not the one that they erased. I put the one that was recorded, the final recording. But he wasn't quite sure what one was actually being offered. And so we have these large lists of data that is leading us perhaps in the wrong direction because we're not quite sure what wages were being offered or not. Phelps Brown Hopkins, and everybody knows Phelps Brown as the one who published an article in the 1950s giving long series of data. But he also published a number of articles on inequality, on labor economics in the 20th century. And when he points to this data, he says this is clearly unusable data to establish standards of living in the 14th, 15th century because we don't know about payments in kind. We don't know if workers were being fed. We don't know how many days the day laborers were working. And John Hatcher was perhaps the most vocal in his criticism, in his article in the book actually called Unreal Wages. And his argument was that there were so many, in particular, after the Black Death, there were so many other forms of payment being offered that the wage data recorded in the account books is not reliable because we don't know what the wages that people were receiving actually represented because there are many perks and other forms of payment. So rather than rely on the data of other historians that they've published in the books, I decided to go into the account registers myself in Marseille and try to extract the data to see what I could find. And I asked myself the question, were the wages being offered sticky or not? And what was the role of other forms of remuneration in terms of the different types of workers? Now, here is some of the data from England. I copied down all of the data from David Farmer, who also went into the archives and was very meticulous, but he took national averages, which normally should smooth wage wages offered. And as we can see, there are many instances where wages decline. Nominal, these are the nominal wages in agricultural and in construction. If we look, I don't know how well you can see, but in the construction sectors, they tend to be less volatile, but there are many instances in which the nominal wages do decline. So if workers were actually resisted, they were not very successful in resisting the decline in the nominal wages. So that's before the Black Death, and I've also put into my Excel file all of the wages from after the Black Death, and we see a slight increase in the nominal wages, of course, a dramatic one directly after the Black Death, but we also see many instances in which nominal wages do decline. Now, this data has been criticized, the way it was collected, taking national averages, averaging together the wages from different manners, and so I will accept these arguments and John Monroe has pointed out the fact that the way he collected the data leads to greater flexibility of wages. So I looked at what did Guy Fourquin in the Paris region point out, and he looked at different villages. And what we can see is that in one village around Paris, in Pierrefitte, they remain remarkably sticky throughout the 1360s and 1370s, except for one exceptional year, whereas in a neighboring village, they seem to be much more volatile. And I don't have the data, I don't know exactly what's going on, but apparently there are different labor practices taking place in one village and another to give the impression of whether wages were sticky or not. So I looked at precisely Marseille. There are account registers from the hospital of the Holy Spirit Hospital throughout the 14th century, in particular the 1330s, 40s, and beyond. And I extracted as many observations as I possibly could, and I did not exclude any on the basis that it didn't seem to be representative. I accepted if they offered a very small wage, a very high wage, whatever. And my observation, and this is why I was very shocked when John Monroe was presenting sticky wages, it didn't seem to correspond at all to my impression of what was going on in these account registers. And indeed, the precise numbers, it doesn't make much of a difference, but I took the standard deviation of wages, and this is in a given year. Not from year to year, but from day to day. And what I've noticed is that there were virtually no 2 days on which wages were the same. Wages were being negotiated up, wages were being negotiated down on a very daily basis. And so there's a variation, and it didn't matter if you're a man or a woman. If you were in the agricultural sector, you were being paid a different value each time. And this continues on up until the Black Death. I can show you particular examples. From one day to the next, it can go from 10 to 8. Okay. To 7, it can go down. It could also go up. And it goes right up to the Black Death, and obviously there's a dramatic increase during the plague years, and I don't know if you can see this very, very clearly, but as plague was introduced into the city of Marseille, wages went up dramatically. They doubled in that particular year, and there was a gap during which they were not doing any work at all. And afterwards, they came back and they went up. What is perhaps more surprising is that there are some workers, they saw their wages decline. So during the height of the epidemic, right afterwards, when the epidemic started to subside, their wages started to go back down. So there was a high level of flexibility in wages until 1350. Starting at 1350, they became perfectly flat. For the next decade, I see almost no variation at all in the amounts given. And the question is why all of a sudden, from one day to the next, wages become very sticky, highly sticky. By the 1360s, some wages started to be more flexible, but not for everybody. And in the 1380s, there was some flexibility and some stickiness as well. And so what we notice is that the employment practices changed dramatically from one year to the next. So they're starting to feel their way through the labor market in this negotiation. What are they going to do? Offer a standard rate or not? And so were wages sticky before the Black Death? Absolutely not in any of these agricultural wages in Marseille. After the Black Death, sometimes they were, sometimes they were not. And if we look at the wage regulations, they don't even correspond to the wage regulation. In 1349, we don't have to talk about the central ordinance. It's quite far from what was being offered in Marseille. But in the city of Marseille in 1349, they set wages at 48 pence per worker, and right afterwards, they're offering significantly more, 60. Now, this is really remarkable in the sense that the people who are setting the wages are members of the municipal council. The members of the municipal council elected 2 members from the council to be the administrators of the hospital and to review the account registers. In fact, they held their council meetings inside of the hospital. So there is hardly any chance that these people writing the registers are trying to evade the statutes that they themselves put into place. And yet, the wages that they are offering on the market seem to be higher than the wages that they are offering, than they had set as a legal price. And this remains relatively constant. The ones that they are offering seem to be higher than the legal rate. And so what is the role of the other forms of remuneration? If we look at the long-term servants, and we have the contracts every year from about 10 to 12 long-term servants, they receive cash, clothing, cloth, measures of cloth, and they receive shoes. There's sometimes payments of grain, although I have a tendency to believe that it was more for the animals than for the worker. And they were clearly fed by the hospital themselves. Other workers, for example, wet nurses, they were not at all fed. They received nothing else except for cash. Now, this changed from one year to the next. In some cases, they received primarily shoes and clothing and cloth, and in other years, there are strictly cash payments for almost all of the workers except 1 or 2. And so the employment practices changed dramatically from one year to the next in exactly the same place for exactly the same employment, and sometimes for exactly the same workers. Now, the question of whether they were fed or not, okay, I have to end. So were they fed or not? I have looked at all of the food payments of the hospital. I see no correlation between the number of workers being hired and the payments of food. The biggest expense for food came during Christmas. They made a lot of expenses for food payments, except during the Black Death. Christmas was not celebrated. They didn't make any exceptional payments. And well, I don't have time to go into all of this data, but I have found no correlation between payments in food and increased hiring of day laborers. However, there are certain mentions in the documents where they say they paid a worker and gave him the food of the hospital, in which case his payment cash wage decreased significantly. So he was only getting about 1/3 what they would get in a normal cash wage if they were fed by the hospital. But because these were indicated in the account registers, it suggests that they were not normally, most of the other day laborers were not being fed, whereas the long-term servants clearly were. So I have to stop now. So my main conclusions were that wages are not inherently sticky. There are certain reasons why they are, and it's based on what sector they're working in and exogenous factors, for example, an epidemic, policy as well. And it is a non-linear evolution. So it's not going from a traditional customary economy where workers are being fed and clothed by the employer because of some feudal relation, and then little by little everything is becoming monetized. We actually see many instances in which it's going in the opposite direction. It's highly monetized, and then going, adjusting to the economic situation by introducing payment in kind. Okay, so I will stop there, and I will cede to questions.
Thank you. Grazie, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. We start the discussion. So, the ones who want to ask questions, they have to fill in this form. You have to fill in this form in order to ask questions. Have you done this?
Sì, no, un altro. Bueno, posso.
Sì, no, mi sposto io.
Che in tavola è stretta.
No, non preoccupatevi.
Se le Barbot. Ongaro, Barbot, Ongaro. Sì, è meglio. Braid, Safley.
Good God. So many questions.
Yes, very stressful.
Ongaro. Sì, il balottaggio.
Chi sta vincendo?
Prima, no? Ah, filosofia. Che cosa è?
Braid. Oh, but no.
Ah!
The last one, I think. The last
One. Right? Right? Michela Barbot, Luca Giulio, Thomas, a moment, Barbot, no, Robert, Michela, Thomas, a ver, que ben liado, Thomas. Oh. Ongaro y Thomas.
Oh boy.
Bueno. Va bene. Abbiamo molti.
We have a lot of questions. There will be long discussion. Let's get started with Professor from Philadelphia, Thomas, Max Safley, Daniele Stron. He has a question for Safley. Microphone.
You end your paper by comparing payment in kind today as well, showing how that is still a thing. I've been wondering whether the comparison would not fit better into other arrangements today that legitimize or try to legitimize rent or extra economic profit. Because what I understood from part of your paper, that some of those extra economic profits that the contractors were making, they had to do because otherwise this business would not exist. So in that case, wouldn't that be more of the broader discussion?
Dopo ho fine. Marianne? Breve.
Be short, please.
My question is about, and you may not have the sources for this, but if we stand back and look at the wider domestic economy, you mentioned that there are houses, for example, which implies that there are families, that the miners had wives and children. And I was wondering when you were talking about the Lehnschaft, whether it was ever possible for teenage children or women to participate in that aspect of the economy in order to supplement the family income. And also, if there were wives of childbearing age, we know from other economies in this period that they're taking in laundry, they might be brewing ale, they might be keeping domestic gardens, all which would augment the family income and make an impact on, that goes beyond what you're seeing with the Fenwert.
Thank you. Allora, giù su.
Okay.
Thank you.
Come up with a clever nickname. Okay, all right. Thanks, Tom, for a very fascinating talk. I have two small questions, I think. The first concerns this Fenwert. So it's a variety of commodities they are paid in. And you could, of course, imagine that they would actually consume those. But with respect to textiles, for instance, we also know that textiles have been used throughout world history as some sort of a commodity money. And I was just wondering to what extent we might also see Fenwert as a combination of consumables and commodity money. The second question is about using alternative means of payment as a means of social control. I think that this is something that will tie in with many of the presentations here this week. But if you look at development economics, for instance, one of the topics quite often is, okay, how to prevent that man, it's usually men, getting paid and then drinking up, consuming everything in the bar. So I was just wondering to what extent it is possible to see paying workers in kind as a way to prevent them from spending the household budget as well. And I guess this also leads to the question to what extent any innkeeper would have accepted textiles or other commodities as pay for drink.
Thank you. Daniele Strum.
It's for a different l'altra relazione. You have shown, posso fare in inglese, no? You have shown that there was a change into kind, or there was, to a higher degree at least, owing to inflation or debasement of currency. I wonder whether that is also connected to the revenues of the same organizations. So whether the donations, the rents that those hospitals and charitable organizations received also moved more into kind, or they've always been more into kind anyways, exactly to prevent debasement. Thank you.
Katia Antunes. Oh, Thomas.
Okay, so there we go. Thank you everyone for the presentations. It seems that I have questions for everyone, but I'll start with Tom. All good. So there we go. I have two questions. One, I think it's rather simple. The other, I'm not sure. So the first one is, when laborers incur debt, can they pay in anything else but monetary payments? Can they pay in labor? Can they pay in commodities? Can they pay in whatever other way? The second question is, to which extent is your story that moment in time when one notices a transition from economies of service to a more capitalized economy? In late 18th century discussions on empire building, usually comparing the Iberian empires with other empires, there's always this hush-hush about Iberians stand with an economy of service. And in economies of service, you pay differently for labor, for commodities, for everything else. People get rewarded as well. In capitalist systems, read here the British, the French, the Dutch case, they have moved into a capitalist system, and thus there has been a transition from these forms of economies of service to a capitalist system. So I wonder whether what you're capturing in the middle of the 16th century is this transition from an economy of service where you have corvée labor, where you have all types of forms that people can pay in labor or other forms for wages, but also for obligations, social obligations, going into a capitalist world where everything is paid in cash. So I wonder whether you're capturing that transition in the minds. Thank you.
And you expect me to answer all of these seriatim? Aha, okay. Daniel, I'm not 100% clear about your question initially, and so I guess I have to act in an uncivil manner by responding to your question with a question. What do you mean?
I mean that for the drug industry, yeah, you need to have a patent so they'll make more profit than if it were competitive. Mm-hmm. So it's the same case here. They don't want to have competition. There will be no competition until the end. And what are claiming that if it was an open market, that industry would not emerge because you need to get all the way into the mountains and bring stuff there and bring workers and all that.
Okay. Piano. You can all hear me, I take it. Okay. I think in principle, yes.
Microphone.
You have to.
Can you talk to the microphone, near the microphone, for the English interpretation? Thank you a lot.
In principle, yes. Initially, you would call it rent-seeking. What we have is a monopoly setup. But this is one of those points where I think placing this in the context of an ecology of work helps not necessarily to change the understanding, but to my way of thinking at least to deepen it a little bit. The common assumption was, and having traveled through the area, I can only agree, albeit 5, 6 centuries later, that without a kind of an arranged supply system, an open market, simply, at least initially, wasn't possible. And it's only over a very long period of time, about 150 years, that we begin to see the very first instances, the very first suggestions of an infrastructure for a market economy begin to emerge. Transportation remains to this day rudimentary. It's very difficult to get to Idria, even with a car. Ljubljana is about 30 kilometers away. It takes about an hour and a half to drive there. And back in the day, it was all foot traffic. Wagons could not pass. The difficulties of supplying a mine that is that separated from established and well-maintained trade routes, which is what separates Idria, say, from mining centers like Schwaz in Tyrol, in some respects made a monopoly arrangement logical. Not necessarily good for all of the parties, but logical to the administrators and the parties involved. It's only over a period of time that you begin to get an established trade and you begin to get retailers settling around the mining district. It takes a very long time before that happens. And you get the possibility of other forms of supply developing, a more open market system. And when that happens, and in 1648, the Habsburg government decides, okay, we're done with these concessionaires and entrepreneurs. We're simply not going to rely on them anymore. It's only at that point that you see, again, slowly, a more open system with multiple suppliers. But it should that shouldn't mislead us into thinking that a market is necessarily, how should I say it, fairer, more egalitarian, because within the town of Idria, very quickly, a single retailer emerges as the principal supplier, although there remain multiple ones. And most of our miners are, in fact, at the close of the day, indebted to him. For the commodities that they use to provision themselves, food, clothing, and that sort of thing. Does that answer the question? Okay. There was a question about the Lehnschaft and the degree to which families were employed, and yes, absolutely. Children, wives, those miners who through the first sign of mercury toxicity is a palsy that doesn't go away. Basically, you shake. And those miners who develop that toxicity are really only good for pulling on a rope, to be perfectly honest. But even they can find a certain minimal employment, and you find them in the Lehnschaft. But the larger question is really one of other kinds of by-employments that mining families could engage in. And the one that remains principal in Idria to this day, but there's evidence of it, is lace making on the part of the wives. And if you go to Idria today, although the mine has ceased, the lace making goes on at a very high level of artisanship, I might add. So I hope that answers your question to a certain extent. Jaco. The Fenwert, yes, in principle, they could be resold. I have no evidence of that anywhere in the records that I've seen. So it could have been happening, certainly. The minor complaints suggest that they didn't have the margin for it. That's only suggestive, not probative. So that certainly it could have happened, but from the historian's perspective, especially one who relies on what the archives say, that would be strictly off the books, so to speak. As an alternative to social control, I guess it depends on how you define social control. One could say that the complaints of the miners are reflective of a kind of self-imposed thriftiness. That is to say, they want the cash rather than the Fenwert. It's not that they object to the Fenwert as such, but what they want is fair value in their estimation. And the commissioners who are periodically assigned to check on this when they know that it's being abused all concur universally that in fact the miners are justified in their complaint, and the local agents, the factors who are running the show, are in fact abusing their situation. They're engaging in what the Germans call Verkauf. That is to say, they're buying in mass quantities at below market values and then basically selling far above market. And that is a reference that we get repeatedly in the archival records. So that in this context, it would seem to me that what the miners are actually talking about is that they're perfectly capable of managing their own books and their own domestic economies, but they cannot do it when they're being given basically substandard goods at above market prices. And then, of course, there are the other difficulties that I mentioned. The fact that the nearest market at this point is 42 kilometers as the crow flies, and going through that region, unless you're a crow, you have to go around and around. That's simply it's simply not possible to do, and so they're trapped in a sense. That doesn't make what you're saying wrong, but I don't really see any evidence of it. Katja. Can they be paid? Could they, if they go into debt, could they use the Fenwert basically to pay their debt? Well, it's basically the same answer that I would have given to Jaco, that I gave to Jaco. In the first place, in principle, yes. If the creditor agrees, then that settles the debt. That's the law of the land, among other things. But again, I get no indication that that actually happens, in point of fact, because they're not being paid so much, according to all of the evidence, both qualitative and quantitative, that survives for the period. They're not being paid so much that they can actually afford to fob some of this off as in lieu of money, as a kind of debt payment. But yes, in principle, it would be possible. And is this an instance of a service economy transitioning into a capitalist economy? I think the dichotomy is false to begin with. I think anybody, okay, I'm going to speak from an American perspective, that is to say, strictly now a US perspective, since one shouldn't generalize about these kinds of things. We're still in a service economy. A supposedly capitalist economy does not rely on monetary payments. And I'm thinking, in part of my own experience, I grew up in the Midwest as the son of a country doctor, and many of my dad's patients paid us in a flat of eggs. That's a dozen, one of the reasons my cholesterol is so high today. Or in a half a beef butchered in lieu of cash. Or they would take labor services, mine, for example. They would agree to hire me for a summer, paying me a very substandard wage in order to pay off their debt to my father. And it happens even in corporate societies. We get, in the United States, we get our companies to help subvent health insurance. That's an alternative to money payment. It's very much a part of the capitalist economy. But to come back to your question, is this a transition of sorts? Well, no, actually I don't think so. This is a highly capitalized economy that we're dealing with here. And the capitalists understand that the necessity of supplying food to their miners not only allows them to mine, but also gives them an added source of profit. I don't see any reason, although they certainly believe in service, as an alternative to money and as a way of advancing their own wealth. And I know that the miners see it the same way from the evidence of Landschaften. They want these Landschaften because they want the status among their co-workers of being a kind of an entrepreneur, someone who not only works at their side, but can provide them a degree of by-employment. So I think, to come full circle on this last question, that notion of service economy on the one hand and a capitalist economy on the other hand is to misunderstand both, in fact. One man's opinion. I'm done.
Grazie mille. Allora, sulla seconda intervento.
Now, the second presentation, Giulio Ongaro e Luca Mocarelli.
Una domanda che parte da una mia...
A question from my research experience. Some years ago, I was working with Renata Sabene on the wages of St. Peter's factory in the 18th century. We found the payment of wages, non-monetary ways, between 5 and 10%, with some surges up and down during the century. And so we try to explain why this oscillation in the payment of wages, not considering the shortage of numerari, logbooks. Also, we found also some inconsistency of farming crisis. And finally, the most difficult element, which was very important, was the prevailing in some staff of some welfare function of the integration of monetary salary in kind salary. And among sources, they also have been used in the archive of Fabbrica del Duomo. I want to know if this element is quite common as a general explanation of these oscillations, and also if this is limited to some structures that can also provide some help. And also, this is also true for other, let's say, non-in-kind salary payers.
Interesting paper, and I think an important paper. You challenge, in many ways, the sort of real wage constructions that people like Paolo Melanima have begun to put together, and you encourage us to think at the end of your paper about the implications of your work for our understanding of that. So I wonder if I could encourage you to speculate a little bit more about that in responding. The real wage data has been used, for example, to think very hard and long about things like little divergence and so on. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit more on that in responding to the implications of what you're finding. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you for your papers. So I have the same question for Giulio and Luca and for Michela. So perhaps I can, because the question is the same, and it has to do with value. So who and which factors are used to determine value? Because you spoke of all types of value that is given to non-monetary payments. I get the feeling that those are determined by the market, which means, going back to the question that was actually just asked to you, what does that do for real wages if you're dependent on market fluctuations on, for instance, commodities or other services or other forms of payment from the prices that are set by the market? That is exactly the same question for Michela, because of what you said about the bankruptcies, right? Because if you spoke of an intrinsic price, the law provides the idea of an intrinsic price value. So how is that intrinsic value sorted? Because intrinsic value of commodities doesn't exist. It's a market value. Sugar values at day 1 at X, at day 10, it will value at least 50% less. If it's any other kind of commodity, it will value differently. If you're talking about buildings, urban buildings are not rural buildings. In a conjuncture of 5 years, things will change. And you can go, objects the same, but also labor. So how is this value, in the cases of bankruptcies and in your cases of non-monetary payments, set? Particularly because I was triggered by what you said, intrinsic value is an abstraction, even at the time, or perhaps not. Yeah.
Daniel, Renzo.
Sì, vorrei aggiungere.
Yes, I want to add on some other additional points, burning points, I guess, in a very telegraphic ways. Two issues. One for a town activity bound to a guild, silk guild, and something else in paper. So the perception I have, this is also true elsewhere, so the perception is that silk weavers, the perception of silk weavers, when in-kind payment is possible, the perception, the feeling in the silk weaver is a total reduction of the remuneration, which is due to the need for the entrepreneur merchants to decrease the manufacturing costs. Okay, that's true. Giulio already must understand everything. I mean, the surcharge of assets given poor quality of given goods. It's not my talk today. What I want to raise is a point. There is a sort of fight of weavers in order to get rid of this possibility. They rejected the in-kind remuneration. They reject this in-kind remuneration. How can you please elaborate on this point? For paper production, paper making, so which happens outside the town setting, in the countryside, or just in small villages. So I speak paper making. Paper making is not bound to any guild. Maybe we have to consider this point. We have to consider another kind of value of a commodity which is given, not quantified from the economic viewpoint, but instead is really valuable socially and politically. I mean the house inside the paper mill. So I never found considerations or reflection quantifying the value of a house inside a paper mill and how much the salary can go up or go down of a worker. But that's really valuable because we speak of families, immigrant families that moved that area. So immigrant families, very often families so bound to xenophobic attack, racist attack. So since people could live in the paper mill, this turns out to be valuable, having a great value, even though it's not economically easy to quantify. Thank you. We split the two answers. I want to make some consideration about the general topic. The link with the work we are doing, with the discussion on real wages, as more divergencies, etc. So maybe you perfectly understood that for us, that such a debate is very weak. It's very weak debate, very weak discussion just from the historical viewpoint. Well, I'm getting old, and since I'm a man of an age, I'm a very radical man now. I believe much historical economy is not considering intelligence as such. History originates complexity, and you can't get rid of complexity. You can't do without, so you have to consider complexity. You cannot wipe this off. You cannot delete or erase complexity. You don't go too far that way, because you're going to fake reality. This is clearly seen with the issue of real wages and the standard minimum wages. We have some limits, very huge limits, the way the consumption basket price has been set up, and also as to the value of wine, bread, loaf of bread for the presence of Annan, and cannot be fixed as Babala said already. So already we have some limits, very strong limitation, very strong limitation also for wages and salaries. So the threshold for salaries, we have a lot of thresholds available. I wrote also my contribution in a special book because salaries, wages are being set up, at least for Milan, in a very caricatural way, like a joke. We have a series of wages identical for all 80 years in a row with no fluctuation. It's really ridiculous. That's something really ridiculous, really. And then, as we try to make you understand, in the wage evaluation, if we want to speak of living standard, the issue is another one. Not only monetary wages, but everything which is non-monetary. As we already said, just about foodstuffs, bread, wine, but also houses, dwellings, rewards, bonuses, so privileges you can obtain. So it's totally different, more complex to manage, to understand reality than it was depicted by us, but the reality where gains, wages, if you consider this under this viewpoint, is higher than the monetary wages are. But in my view, there is a crucial point which has been also said many times when we said of value. So the crucial point is that even today, not only in the past, but even today, it's very difficult to price work. It's very difficult to price work because also the economists say the labor market is a totally anomalous market, not laying down in the usual standards. So in the non-classic economy canons or standards, it's very difficult to value work. It's very difficult to price work. And if you speak of the pre-industrial era or period, we have another point which is quite blurred. What's the weight monetary economy in that world? What the importance of monetary economy? The big point is, what's the importance of monetary economy in such a world? As Tom said, in a world where money is a commodity, any commodity can be used as money, as a currency, as money as a currency. Let's take an example. Renzo said something about silk. Recently, I was just in charge to judge a PhD dissertation in Geneva, building out the parallel market, which originates with the thieves of the cocoons and silk treated. So cocoons and treated silk, that's an interesting market run by women in Lombardy of the 18th century. That market is a market where cocoons and the spin silk are used as a currency substitute. So we are in a world where we have lots of different circuits from this viewpoint. And this is really charming now to answer the same question. So factories in San Petrolio, San Pietro, San Peter's factory. I remember the factory of the Milano Duomo. They have different management system. They do not manage labor in the same way. What happens in Milan? Okay, so for Rome this was good, but not for Milan. You don't see that in Milan because at a certain time the factory is subcontracting to subcontractors for labor, all Chinese. So what you find in books, in the logbooks, in the ledgers of the factory, is what the factory give the subcontractor to pay laborers, manpower. But it's not the wages, the real wages paid. But if you look at other rare cases, you see the accounts of these subcontractors. They add on something according to the crisis, okay, but much is added on according to the working conditions. If the work is done in a dangerous situation, if there's extraordinary time work, also if we have dangerous work. So they add on something on the ledgers. Either they pay more in money, they can add on wine, commodities, soups, vegetable soups, many other foodstuffs, or clothes. But that's a different world. From the point of St. Peter's factory, a fabrica. It's also true, and I finish this off, passing over to Giulio, there's another point to recall. The links, the bonds exist in between the way they pay the charity foundations and the market fluctuations of trends for products. But in my view, we have to bear something in mind, that all these charity foundations are big landowners. So the point of the value, of the market value, does not exist. The Milan hospital, once again, in 1930, Cagranda is the greatest landowners in Lombardy, still having 10,000 acres of land after Napoleon, after the confiscation in Lombardy, and still today, that's one of the major, income source of the polyclinic in Milan. The foundation inherited this big legacy. This value of these commodities, understanding this value is not that easy because they don't buy these commodities in the market. Commodities as they produce. They're just having full availability of these assets, of these commodities. What Renzo said for the merchants, okay, that's true. So one part in nature turns out to be a source of higher gain, profit. This makes it possible to pay less, maybe, than the real, market price. And this is not surprising me. In Luca, weavers do not want to accept this way of payment because Luca weavers, they refuse it. They don't want to be cheated.
Giulio.
I pass it over to Giulio. Just a few points. For the issue of the charity foundations, for Bologna case, I didn't notice this. Rather, we have some trends, also linked with the works done, because San Petronio has not the potentials, also the charity potential versus helping structures, help structures versus St. Peter's Charity Foundation. So the point, the possible impact of a review of calculation of salaries. So, okay, this will open up to another freestanding workshop. In my view, briefly, Luca already said something, but we have three major elements, in my view, that might be affected by this.
First, considering urban wages and rural wages as well, considering that most of the population was living in the countryside. This is a very important change. And then we should also be considering the side in kind. Okay, yes, but in England as well, they used to pay in kind. Therefore, at the very end, the comparison is not changing, but we don't know to which extent, and we don't know the percentage. Therefore, high wage economy reasoning can be changed. Maybe yes, maybe not. Therefore, on one side, we can see this tendency to payment monetization, but on the other side, a higher percentage of payment in kind. And then another issue, which I think is coming out, and which is also very interesting, and it also comes from the last presentation in the morning. We keep speaking about wage level, but there is also something dealing with volatility, which is not just saying, okay, prices go up, go down, etc. It is the very stability of prices and wage stability as well, having some effects on economy, And the presence or absence of something in kind has an important impact together with other variables. I think that this should also be taken into consideration. As for the rest, I think Luca spoke, and I will stop here.
Giovanni Muto.
Giovanni Muto for Michela Barbot.
Sulla relazione della Barbot. Sì. Ecco il caso che ci è stato presentato.
Okay, the case that was presented by Michela Barbot is very interesting. But of course, it poses two main issues. First, some exchanges, some relationship between, or this relation between private people, creditor and debtor, and some exchange, res pro pecunia, as Michela said, some commodity which is settling the debt. But what happens if one of the two subjects is a public subject, in this case the state, in its various forms? And if the debt is not settled with a material commodity, but with other possible cash payment, like in the case in Naples, 1649, datio insolutum. Okay, with different debts the state has to money lenders. They have to deal with all the tax, the dies. The theoretical paradigm. So the juries you mentioned, did they ever consider that? And in practice, besides the case of Naples, for example, for Milan on France, did you see any case like that, like the one in Naples, 1649? Did you find such documents like this?
Maria Fusaro.
Well, I had 3 questions. One actually has just been masterfully asked, so I kind of aligned myself with the previous question. Second one is about whether you have detected, you can tell us a bit more about the criteria of selections of those evaluators. You mentioned that they were taken from some particular groups, but whether you can see some trends, whether you've seen criteria being implemented. And the third question is probably unfair, but if it's not a question, it's a suggestion. Which one of these two different approaches, if you will, the Italian or the French, you see more reflected in the adoption of the legal principle in common law? Because I can see how it would go, but I would be very intrigued by your answer. Thank you.
Gaetano.
Un breve commento che è anche un modo per...
Some comment, and I would like to ask Michela, if you can, will you please go into depth vis-à-vis one of the most important aspects, datium insolutum, and privilege of citizenship. Going back to what Giovanni said, in the accounting documents in Naples in the 17th century, especially starting from the 20s and 30s, the use of datium insolutum is very frequent. And it is peacefully accepted among privates, except when you see some frequent case of commodities or cash being transferred for datium insolutum from merchants not having Naples citizenship to citizens from Naples, because the citizenship is one of the conditions of not paying taxes on commodities, and therefore this was a moment when administrative courts would play a role, because this is changing as compared with the state, because the fiscal condition is changing. And I think it is very, very interesting and intriguing. As Giovanni said, there is mid of the 17th century, there is a moment when this formula is being used to settle disputes. And in one of the most important administrative documents in the 80s of the 17th century by Giulio Cesare Cervellino, a jurist, this is properly explained with details. With this exception, considering the adoption of this legal system, you see, this is changing. And I'd like to ask you to go into that.
Non so come. Ah, va bene? Ok.
Thank you very much for these very interesting questions. Posso parlare italiano? Sì, sì, yes. I'd like to start from the question by Professor Muto, which is partially an answer to the question by Professor Sabatini. Public subjects, first of all. It is a new subject for me, but my contribution shows that datio insolutum is not a system only for privates. It is an instrument, it is a bilateral, two-way. There must be a creditor and a debtor, according to jurists. If one of the two subjects is public, this is a datio obligatoria, a datio which is much more institutionalized, and at the same time it gives more space for public subjects, especially when public subjects are creditors, because the other thing I'd like to underline is that in my case studies, especially empirical and especially based in Milano, public subjects, the tax system is more frequently creditor than debtor in the real estate market in Milano.
Limitato. Quindi
in the land system. Therefore, it is not a datum insolutum when there is a plurality of creditors. In this case, as is frequently the case today, we need to assess the order and to set the priority among such creditors, like in the settlement before bankruptcy. There is always a phase where you try to arrange the order. And in this case, the datum insolutum, since it is a bilateral system, it stops working. Then there are many other procedures. It is not the only one. But answering your question, I still haven't found any case when it is a debtor subject. Therefore, it is what Gaetano Sabatini was saying is very interesting. I hope this answers the question. From the fiscal viewpoint in France, datum insolutum is part of selling with the same obligations as selling from the fiscal viewpoint or tax viewpoint. Therefore, the answer to Maria Fusaro. As for criteria, the criteria with which such evaluators have been selected, once again, there is a large variability according to the context. But what comes out from the statutes is that common friends, the so-called common friends, are excluded, that were admitted to some medieval statutes. Mikoman, a neighbor or any subject identified by the party with no conflicts of interest and no relatives, we have this publicity element. Public institutions, we have the provision court in Milano, even at a local level, they decide to give this mandate exclusively to members of the guild, members of guilds, and such members, guild members, change according to the commodity to be assessed. I found cases where, for example, I don't know the Italian name. Sorry?
Fabbri,
Metal workers, the metal workers. The
blacksmiths.
The blacksmiths.
Forse ferronier, fabbro.
Are supposed to estimate commodities. Therefore, public legitimacy given to such subjects having a mandate. And in the case of architects, it is frequently a monopoly because there is some deep they have to be skilled. As for the French case and Paris in particular, we have more or less the same level. We have experts are public officers having an office, and they are supposed to decide attributing or giving a value to property. As to the intrinsic value, it is found everywhere. It is universal, both France and Italy. And in France, it is not reported in details, because in France, I did some comparative study with a colleague. In France, there is no corresponding of manuals. There are no manuals, and this intrinsic value, how is it being defined? The minimum definition is production costs. What are production costs? The cost of raw materials. Then we have the preservation, the state of preservation or preservation state, repairs, etc. And the third thing, labor cost. It is part of the intrinsic value. This is a value mentioned by everyone, but everyone says that it should be applied locally. It is a local convention, and that's why evaluators have to decide. And I forgot to tell you something. Evaluators, and this brings us back to the concept of a citizen. The evaluator has to be a citizen of that state, knowing measures of unit of measures, the activities, and to attribute a value. And this value is not just objective. It is not purely objective, but you say it is objective. Is it the only system? No. Evaluators have the right to add extrinsic values, therefore market price. But in the case of lesio enormis, it is not possible. It means that we have to go back to the intrinsic value. I hope this answers the question.
Per finire l'intervento di Robert Braid.
Ecco, faceva. Guida Alfani, Robert Braid.
Robert, your paper made me think of a nice article published a few years ago in the Economic History Review by Sam Cohn on labor legislation after the Black Death. And he was discussing the spread of these laws contra laboratores in Italy and other European areas, so laws against the workers, in practice against the unfair and reasonable requests, or rural workers in particular. And it seems to me that your case for Marseille kind of fits that picture, and I would like to know, because these laws have to be repealed because they appear to be untenable in the market conditions after Black Death. So they are introduced, they can't remain in place, and they are repelled. And I also wonder whether the increase in non-kind payments, which you report in Marseille, is actually maybe a way to get around those laws, and I wonder whether that's a kind of more general case, because I mean, if Cohn is correct, that was kind of a, a general change in labor legislation for at least a period. More intense in Italy than in other areas, I think, but still kind of general. Thank you.
Katia?
So, Robert, my apologies, I'm not a medievalist, so this comes from total ignorance. If I understood the end of your talk, you conclude that the wages you see are unsticky, or less sticky than John has argued in the past. So my question is, what happens to your idea of stickiness, or lack thereof, if you crisscross your data with a couple of premises? So are there differences between skilled and unskilled, or specialized and unspecialized labor? Is manufacturing and agricultural labor more or less prone to be attached to stickiness or unstickiness? Because that seems to be the model for the 20th century, right? You show that transition from towards manufacturing and services. There's a change also in the modeling of economists. So is there a parallel in the Middle Ages? The second point is, what happens when you look at this data from a perspective of countryside and urban settings? Are professions in the countryside less or more prone to be sticky? Because then enters the question of legislation. What do guilds and urban privileges do for laborers or not, or the stickiness of wages? Because it can be that in environments where welfare legislation or principles are enacted, that you would have stickiest wages. And one final question, I think, going back to what Guido just asked, how do the non-monetary, it's a question about value again, how do the non-monetary payments react to market prices? So can you see actually increase in wages, thus stickiness, once you sum up the basis of monetary payments with what is non-paid in monetary items? Thank you.
Grazie. William Katem.
I am a medievalist, but no more informed than anybody. My question is for Professor Braid. I would add to your list of modern economists who talk about sticky wages, apart from John Monroe, and so I also mentioned Paul Krugman calls it a feature of the real world. The thing that concerned me, the thing I was interested in, is that in the beginning it seemed to me you talked kind of globally about sticky wages as being a problem, and you mentioned government wages, you mentioned private institutions and so on, and I really like the fact that you referenced Robert Solow, who talked about the difference between public wages and private wages, and that's essentially my question. Nonostante John Monroe, sticky wages are a problem, and I wrote a book once, and since I have a sense of humor, I called it Petrarch's War, and I looked at wages in Florence from 1345 to 1354, which were on government budgets, 40 different professions, from 1345 to 1354, and I was shocked to find that virtually no public salaries moved up during the Black Death. I don't know, a few. The police forces didn't, did the podestà and so on and so forth. But the thing that was most striking to me, and I wondered if you could comment on this, because I don't know if you know, is that I decided to actually even graph the wages of soldiers, because they're the largest part of the workforce, with knowing full well that I'd be called a military historian in doing so. And one thing that was striking about them, I continued all the way into the 15th century, and their wages remained sticky throughout the Black Death all the way through 1363. Then in 1370, when there's no war whatsoever, they go up dramatically. And then after that, for the rest of the century, into the 15th century, they go down. And so what I wanted to say essentially is this. What struck me in all of this is that, and I want to maybe turn the question around in part, and wondered whether you thought, or people think also, in terms of the employer, the fact that these are public wages, that it's a public officials who are being paid by public funds, whether the revenue of the state, the revenue of public things as opposed to private entities, has some bearing on the type of remuneration that people receive. Thank you.
Grazie. E Philosophy?
Hi, Robert. Thanks very much indeed for a very interesting and stimulating paper. Sorry, it's a kind of broad question, really, in a way, but where are we going with real wage data, in a sense, now? Where does it, the kind of analysis we heard from Giulio and Luca and yourself in terms of the sort of disaggregation of that data, the complexity of it. I mean, you have a fantastic, very interesting series from Marseille that seems, in a sense, to be a real challenge if you're going to try to put that into a series, really. And you conclude, and you encourage us to reflect on the difficulties of applying the English data, but the English data, as you say, has also got its own problems, and not only for the Middle Ages. You think about Judy Stevenson's recent assault on the work of Bob Allen in terms of the high wage data there and how it's taken apart. So I guess also you join us at the end to think about the ways in which legislators and justices maybe give us a sort of guide, but what I've really encouraged you to do is to reflect a little bit on where this leaves us, really, in terms of thinking about putting together the long-term series of a kind that allow these comparisons, or is that actually increasingly a futile exercise? Thank you.
Marianne?
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Guido's question to press you to discuss a little bit more about the non-monetary forms of remuneration. In particular, I'm thinking of, in England, some of the work that's been done by people like Chris Dyer, who has found that the quality of food that agricultural laborers were being served went up. And that you transferred more, there was more meat, for example, so that the wages weren't necessarily that different, but the perks definitely went up, and it was a way to secure the employment in a scarce labor situation. My other question is, I was very struck by the rigid division of labor that you have. I mean, it's wonderful that you can break it down by male and female types of work, but does that mean that you have no, there is some speculation in England that after the Black Death, when you have labor scarcity, and this is more into the 1370s and later, that you have more women entering the marketplace, and since women take lower wages, it would drag the wages down at that point. Do you have any evidence at all, for example, because it probably not from what I'm seeing, but there is also in England some suspicion. You have a couple entries where you think they're young boys. I mean, it's a little bit hard to interpret, and there is some work in England that there's a catch-all term that could include women. It's a lower pay rate.
Grazie.
Well, thank you very much for all these questions. Considering the fact that I'm the only person standing between you and lunch, I will try to be brief. Yes, I actually was disappointed by my own research, because I was really expecting to find lots of extra payments of in kind after the Black Death. And I do see a certain number of these in kind payments. Now, so this answers Guido's question. My first study of all the laws around Europe, there are many in which there's an initial law that sets the wage with no indication about the payments in kind or feeding or whatnot. In virtually all of the follow-up legislation, there is some indication that the behavior of economic agents changed. So whether it's the laws in France in the 1330s where workers are reducing their work hours to be able to work elsewhere or on their own plots, shortening the days to adapt to the caps and the wages. Or after the Black Death, I also find many laws that indicate that workers are demanding food. In fact, in Provence, the same time, so at the same time, right after the Black Death, in Aix-en-Provence, we have this problem of time. So workers, it's assumed that there was regulations of the labor market, day wages, and workers were apparently shortening their day. And the city came in and said, no, you can't do that. You have to work from sun up to sundown. In another town, in Cedere, there was the problem of in-kind payment. And so we find that workers were demanding more food and drink. And so I saw all of this in the laws, and I was really expecting to see it in the account registers. In fact, what I find is that there's really very little. There are perks from time to time, what I see. But when I try to compare all the payments of food, I see really no correlation between hiring more workers in February and March, for example, for pruning vines, or in September for picking the grapes. I don't see any surge in payments for food by the hospital. It's a negative finding. I was really expecting to find it, and I don't. And in fact, in Marseille, it's one of the only places where the laws do not address this question of payment in kind. They're more concerned with the mobility of workers. You can't leave the town, you have to come back after sundown and whatnot. They're more concerned with the mobility of workers than with this question of payment in kind. And I'm not exactly sure why. So the question of skilled versus unskilled labor and countryside and urban, this is an interesting example of a city where there are about 20,000 people before the Black Death. So it's a town, it's a relatively big town, but they're hiring agricultural labor. And so I did not look at the urban trades. I don't have wage data for the urban trades. There are some sporadic payments to repair this or that, but they're all piece rate. And so it would really depend on the type of job that they were doing. So I can't really see in the urban trades. Relative to the skills of agricultural workers, we could imagine that some workers were paid more and some were paid less. And that is clear in some instances when they hire, say, 10 workers for a particular rate, and it doesn't come out to an even number. Right? So clearly some workers were receiving more and some workers were receiving less. This increases, I would say, after the Black Death, when they were outsourcing, and then rather than giving day by day, we're paying this much to prune the vines to 10 men, and very often they will indicate at this rate per man. And we'll come back to this gender question. Very often what they will be doing is they'll pay one block payment to an outsider and say to take care of the harvest of grapes for this season, and they give one big block payment. Now the block payment indicates how much they paid per person. What they actually paid to the workers, that is much less clear. Whereas before the Black Death, it's really quite clear that they were paying, it seemed that they were paying directly to the workers because there's an entry per day for each of the workers. So relative to the prices, yes, I would love to be able to compare real wages and get the prices. There's problems with the accounting in Marseille. In the hospital, whereas before the Black Death, they grouped the payments of food per week. And I don't know what they're buying, right? But I know how much the hospital paid per week for their household, including all the sick people. So if there were more or less sick people, well, that would change their payments. But again, it doesn't clearly correspond to hiring seasons. So I really do not get the impression that they're feeding their workers, either before or after the Black Death. They're day laborers. After the Black Death, we have it's enumerated, and it's a big mess, because it's every day we bought this many candles for this much oil for this much wine, this much, and it's a big mess, big long list of things which is complicated to put together. And I could trace prices and real wages after the Black Death, but before the Black Death, I don't really have enough observations to create a basket of consumables and the corresponding price. So that is one big problem with the source material that I have. Did legislation lead to stickiness? Absolutely. It seems absolutely clear that this is the case. And this is actually a question I would have during lunch, perhaps. But we often observe that the wages in the accounts do not correspond to the legal rates. And people are saying that, yes, they're trying to evade the statutes, or the statutes are ineffective. And in this particular instance, I don't know how it can possibly be the case. The people paying the wages are the city officials who set the rates to begin with, and they're holding their counsel inside the hospital itself. So, and this will lead into the question of public and private as well. So I see, it seems to be a very interesting question of, they're not avoiding their own statutes, right? But it seems like they're fixing a particular level, and this is the legal level, and yet they're willing to accept to pay people a little bit more and not feel like they're breaking their own laws. And so I think we should be a little bit more cautious about criticizing the ineffectiveness of legislation. By setting a bar relatively low, it's allowing employers to negotiate not far above that bar. So, Bill, relative to your question about public and private, absolutely. So it was Simon Kuznets who pointed out this difference between the construction workers and the administrative, or the government workers, that they were very sticky wages. Indeed, and if you were outside of construction or outside of government work, your wages tend to fluctuate a lot more. And so I actually find it quite surprising that you observe that there was no increase in wages after the Black Death, even for government workers, because what I can see in my data, they double. In fact, they double during the Black Death. The only thing that stopped them was when they finally decided to sit down around the table and say, okay, now we're going to settle this because this is going too far, and they set a price. And at that point, after not during the Black Death, right after the Black Death, they said clearly deliberations, bylaws, by the city council to cap wages. So yes, these are definitely government jobs, because they're being paid by the city officials. Philip Schofield, your question about the real wage data and where are we going with all this, I really don't want to comment about what other people find in their source material. And if historians are looking in the data, in the account registers and the account rolls, and they are observing this, then obviously I will accept what they find. This is what I found in Marseille, and what I see is that practices change very quickly. And so another example, and we'll have another talk tomorrow on long-term employment in Marseille, but from what I gather in the long-term employment in the hospital, it seemed really quite radical that in 1338, virtually every single employee of the hospital, for whether they're working with the animals or working in the hospital itself, taking care of the sick or whatnot, they were receiving a very mixed salary. And some people were receiving only payment in kind. And in 4 years later, virtually everybody was receiving just cash, except for 2 of the 12 employees. And so the employment practices can change very quickly. So this question of creating long series of wage data, I am really, really very skeptical. Until you go scratching in the account registers yourself and find how complicated it is to take out this data, I don't think we should be establishing 7 centuries of wage series. It's not really representative of what's going on the market. And finally, this question of the quality, yes, absolutely, I would agree that Chris Dyer, he no doubt did observe that the quality of the food increased, and therefore that's a particular perk. And I do see in certain circumstances after the Black Death, certain workers are receiving perks where it was not the case before. But they're relatively small, and it's exceptional. So they can be qualified as perks and not as full form of remuneration, but perhaps particular advantages to work when it's not nice out or when it's particularly difficult. Relative to the question of gender, the advantage in these registers is that they clearly indicate that they're hiring men, they're hiring women, they're hiring boys, and there's another category that they call mendic. And this one I have a little bit of difficulty with. They're receiving payments which are below men. It's masculine, right? And so it's a masculine word, so I'm assuming they're hiring men, but they're being hired at a much lower rate than normal men. So I don't know what this fourth category is. Perhaps somebody can illuminate it, but it's clear that women, when they're hiring women. My real question is, in relative to women's wages, and by the way, after the Black Death, there are some instances where the jobs that were being done by women before were being done by men. Sorry, I have it. If you want to see the reference, I can show it to you. But it doesn't stick. It doesn't last for very long. But the year after the Black Death, they hire men to bind the vine shoots, and they're being paid slightly more than the women, but they're not being paid as much as men would be paid to prune vines. There are some instances, they're very rare, where they pay men and women, and they receive, theoretically, according to the account register, the same fee, the same wage, which I found very, very surprising. But when they do mix genders, it's very difficult to know. Sometimes they say, we hired 3 men and 2 women to do this. And then I don't have who got what. So it could very well be within a family. It could be a group of people who know each other and they distributed the wages between. But the registers are very clear whether they're hiring men or women in this. So it's perhaps good. And the thing that I was very curious about is wet nurses. How their wages skyrocketed after the Black Death, like really radically increased much, much more than the other female workers. Male workers saw their wages increase, day workers saw their wages increase dramatically. Female day laborers saw them increase, but not as much as men. But wet nurses were receiving wages that were quite similar to long-term, full-salaried agricultural workers. And sometimes, which is very curious, when they're hiring a long-term servant, several of the men are referred to as the husband of this wet nurse. So as if they know the wet nurse relatively well, and when they're indicating the man, he is the, oh, who is this guy? Oh, he's the husband of so-and-so, instead of the opposite way around. So, yes, so there are clearly some families being both employed by the hospital, and it's not always the man that receives more than the woman. The wet nurses, for some reason, receive incredibly high salaries and only in cash. And I had a question, why would they be receiving so much after the Black Death? And that might explain why sometimes men were doing women's work, because women, if they could be a wet nurse, why would they be picking grapes? So I really don't know what else to say about that. So thank you very much.
Grazie a tutti gli intervenenti.
Thank you all the speakers. And now we're going to meet again at 3 p.m. after lunch. Enjoy your lunch. I just want to